The process begins in the dim, flickering light of a peasant cottage in 1912. The air in Belgrade is thick with the smell of wet coal and the metallic tang of impending rain. Outside, the world is screaming. The drums of the First Balkan War are a rhythmic, hollow pounding in the streets, a heartbeat of a nation preparing to bleed. Milunka Savić stands before a mirror that has seen better days. It is cracked, reflecting a fractured version of a girl the world expects to stay home and wait for the men to return. She holds a pair of heavy tailor's shears. The steel is cold, biting into her palm. She doesn't hesitate. The sound of the blades meeting is a sharp, final snip, and years of tradition fall to the floor in dark, heavy clumps of hair. She binds her chest with linen strips. She pulls them tight, tighter than she thinks she can bear, until the breath catches in her throat and stays there. It is a manual compression of her soul. She isn't just hiding her body. She is erasing the only version of herself the world is willing to accept. At the recruitment office, the atmosphere is a factory of indifference. The sergeant behind the desk is a man made of paper and ink. He doesn't look up. To him, the line of boys is a conveyor belt of meat for the grinder. He represents a system that values volume over vision. He sees a sharp jawline, hears the name Milun, her brother's name, and slides a form across the table with a grunt. The fatal flaw of the military machine is its own arrogance. It believes it can define a human being by their height and the way they hold a rifle. The sergeant stamps the paper. The sound is like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. To the state she is now Soldier 245, a cog, a tool. They don't see the woman, they only see the uniform. The transition to the front is a descent into a new kind of hell. The Serbian army is a rigid pyramid of command that values protocol over perception. Milunka now Milun learns the language of the mud. It is a language of wet boots, the smell of cordite, and the way the earth shakes when the heavy guns find their range. While the other men huddle for warmth, boasting of victories they haven't earned, she stays in the shadows. She is a ghost in the machine. She is the one who notices the way the wind shifts before a storm. She is the one who cleans her rifle until the bolt moves like silk on silk. The high command in Belgrade is busy drawing lines on maps. They treat the Balkan terrain like a flat table, ignoring the jagged reality of the mountains. They have formulated a strategy of crystallized arrogance. The prevailing mindset among the officer class is simple. The enemy is a peasant rabble. We will crush them with the weight of our tradition. The manual says we march in columns, and so we shall march. They believe their system is too large, too organized, to be halted by a disorganized foe. But the machine has a deadly gap. The logic of the 1912 battlefield is a black box of carnage. The input: thousands of men are ordered to charge across open ground in neat, linear formations. The mechanic of death. The enemy is equipped with the Maxim machine gun, a mechanical scythe that fires 600 rounds per minute. It doesn't matter how brave the soldier is. The physics of lead and velocity are indifferent to courage. The output: the machine betrays the men, and the field becomes a graveyard of professional pride. Milunka watches this failure from the edge of the line. She sees the lieutenant, a man named Jovan, with a mustache, waxed to a point, standing atop a trench, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He looks down at her as she huddles low in the dirt, checking the tension of her bootlaces. "You," he barks, his voice dripping with a sneer. "Why are you hiding in the muck?" A Serbian soldier stands tall. "We are the masters of this land. The Bulgarians will flee at the mere sight of our steel." He is the personification of the obstacle. He values the image of power over the reality of survival. Milunka offers a sharp, silent salute. She doesn't tell him that by staying low, she can hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the enemy's sappers tunneling under the ridge. She doesn't tell him that the tall soldiers are the ones who get their heads taken off by snipers. She simply waits. The battle begins not with a roar, but with a scream of metal. The Serbian advance hits a wall of lead. The meat grinder begins to turn. In the chaos, the system screams in panic. Commands are shouted and then lost in the roar of the artillery. The neat columns break. The professional army becomes a mass of terrified individuals, drowning in the blood-soaked clay. But in the dark, Milunka is already moving. While the establishment loses its mind, she is finding her purpose. She doesn't follow the manual. She moves between the craters like a predator. She finds the blind spots in the Bulgarian fire. She realizes that the machine can be broken if you know where to strike. She is the ghost in the machine, the quiet competence that the loud men in gold braid never saw coming. But as the shells continue to fall and the lines begin to collapse entirely, her secret becomes a secondary concern. The front is falling. The miracle they need is standing in the mud, bleeding from a wound she cannot show anyone, holding a rifle she knows how to use better than any man in the regiment. The laughter is about to stop. The secret didn't die with a bang, but with the quiet hiss of a medic's breath as he cut away a blood-soaked tunic. When the truth of Milunka's identity was finally laid bare on a field hospital cot, the Serbian high command didn't see a hero. They saw a problem, a flaw in the blueprint. The establishment offered her a choice that felt more like a sentence: transfer to the nursing corps or go home. They believed a woman's place in war was to clean the wounds, not to cause them. But they had miscalculated the spirit of the ghost they had trained. Milunka stood before her commanding officer, her body still map-marked with the scars of her first campaign. And she didn't plead. She didn't beg. She simply waited. For 2 hours, she stood at attention in the freezing rain, a living statue of defiance until the system blinked first. By the autumn of 1916, the world had changed. The First Balkan War had bled into the Great War, and the Macedonian front had become a landscape of jagged rock and frozen despair. At the Kurna River bend, the earth itself seemed to be trying to shake off the men clinging to its surface. Milunka was no longer a secret. She was a psychological weapon, a ghost in the machine that the Serbian army now wielded with a mixture of awe and unease. She had become the personification of the paradox. While the generals in their distant chateaus obsessed over troop movements and logistics, Milunka was focused on the weight of a single object in her hand, the M1912 hand grenade. In the logic of the trenches, the grenade was the ultimate fatal flaw for the defender. To satisfy those who study the mechanics of death, the process is brutally simple. Input: the soldier pulls the safety pin and releases the lever. Black box: a spring-loaded striker hits a percussion cap, igniting a chemical fuse that burns for exactly 4.5 seconds. Output: The cast iron casing shatters into hundreds of jagged teeth, turning a confined space into a whirlwind of steel. It is a pocket-sized artillery strike, designed to kill what the rifle cannot see. Milunka didn't just throw grenades, she spoke through them. The Bulgarian forces holding the heights at Kaymakchalan were comfortable. They were arrogant. From their concrete bunkers, they looked down upon the Serbian lines with the crystallized arrogance of men who believed they held the high ground. Their commander, a colonel who prided himself on European tactical theory, dismissed the Serbian presence as a spent force. He treated the mountain as an impenetrable fortress, believing that no human could scale the sheer rock face under the weight of a full combat load. He was right. A Heroine, a normal soldier, following the manual, would have been slaughtered. But Milunka didn't believe in the manual. She began her ascent under the cover of a moonless sky, where the fog was so thick it felt like breathing wet wool. She didn't carry a heavy pack. She carried a bag of grenades and a purpose that defied the physics of the slope. While the Bulgarian sentries huddled around small fires, laughing about the she-soldier they had heard rumors of, she was already above them. They treated the silence of the mountain as a sign of their own safety. They believed the Serbian spirit had been broken by the winter, but they had fatally underestimated their opponent. The silence wasn't submission. It was a predator holding its breath. The mountain didn't belong to the men in the bunkers. It belonged to the shadow rising from the mist. The first grenade didn't just destroy the machine gun nest. It shattered the enemy's reality. Imagine the scene through the eyes of a Bulgarian conscript. You are in a perfect defensive position. You are told the enemy is miles away, broken and cold. Then the world explodes. Out of the smoke and the jagged rocks, a figure emerges, not a company of men, a single person. The black box of her tactic was simple: speed and terror. She moved with a surgical precision that the military academies couldn't teach. She didn't stay to trade shots. She moved, she threw, and she vanished. In the chaos of the Heroine River bend, Milunka found herself facing a trench filled with 23 Bulgarian soldiers. By the rules of engagement, she was a dead woman, 1 against 23. The system says you retreat. The manual says you call for support. Milunka did neither. She utilized the most potent weapon in her arsenal, the shock of the impossible. She didn't just attack their bodies, she attacked their will. She stood at the edge of their trench, a silhouette framed by the fire she had started, and she didn't look like a victim. She looked like an inevitability. The sight of her, a woman, bleeding, eyes bright with a terrifying focus, holding the levers of death, did what no artillery barrage could. It broke them. The psychological weight of her defiance was heavier than the steel they carried. One by one, 23 men, trained for war and hardened by the elements, threw down their rifles. They surrendered not to an army, but to a symbol. She marched them back to her own lines, a line of broken giants led by a ghost. When she reached the Serbian camp, the silence that met her was deafening. The officers, who only months ago had tried to send her home to scrub floors, watched in a state of cognitive collapse. They couldn't reconcile the underdog they had mocked with the warrior who had just achieved a miracle. But even as the medals began to arrive, the French Legion of Honor, the Russian Cross of Saint George the System, was already preparing its counterattack. They were happy to use her blood to hold the line, but they were already looking for ways to erase her from the peace. Because a hero like Milunka Savić is a dangerous thing for an establishment built on the myth of male superiority. She was a living reminder that their rules were arbitrary, their traditions were fragile. As the war entered its final, most brutal phase, Milunka continued to charge. She was shot. She was stabbed. She was blown into the air by shells that should have ended her story. But every time the machine tried to kill her, she crawled back out of the mud. She was the symbol they couldn't let die, and the truth they couldn't wait to forget. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a cold, calculating respect that felt more like a cage than a tribute. They knew the war would end one day, and they knew that in the world they intended to build after the smoke cleared, there was no room for a woman with 23 prisoners and a bag of grenades. The smoke of the Great War finally cleared in 1918, leaving behind a world that looked nothing like the one Milunka had stepped out of. The empires had crumbled, the maps had been redrawn, and the system was busy reinventing itself. For a brief, shining moment, the world remembered her. The French government offered her a mansion in Paris and a pension for life, a reward for the blood she had spilled on their behalf. But Milunka looked at the offer, then looked back toward the jagged peaks of the Balkans. She chose the mud. She chose Belgrade. She expected a home. What she found was a cold, institutional amnesia. The new state, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, was an establishment built on the same crystallized arrogance as the old one. Once the threat of annihilation was gone, the generals and the politicians no longer had a use for a ghost in the machine. A woman who had captured 23 men was an inspiration during the slaughter, but in the quiet of peace, she was an embarrassment. She was a reminder of a time when the proper order of things had collapsed. The fatal flaw of post-war society is its short memory. By the 1920s, the medals, the Légion d'honneur, the Croix de Guerre with palm, the Karageorge star with swords were tucked away in a wooden box. The woman who was the most decorated female combatant in the history of warfare was given a job as a cleaning lady. The establishment that she had bled 42 times to preserve now required her to scrub its toilets, while the men who had stayed in the rear during the meat grinder now sat in velvet chairs. Milunka was on her knees, her hands red from lye and cold water. This was the bitter aftertaste of victory. The system didn't just ignore her, it attempted to erase her. They wanted her to be a quiet, invisible ghost once more. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. Milunka didn't spend her meager wages on herself. In the shadows of her small, cramped apartment in Voždovac, she began a new campaign. She didn't use grenades this time. She used bread. She adopted and raised over 30 orphaned children, some her own, many others found in the wreckage of the wars that continued to plague the region. While the state debated budgets and borders, she was running a private sanctuary for the victims of their failures. Even when the Second Great War came in 1941, and the Nazi occupiers tried to invite her to a banquet to capitalize on her fame, she refused. She chose the concentration camp over collaboration. She chose the basement over the podium. By October 5th, 1973, the world had almost entirely forgotten. She lived in a small apartment that smelled of old paper and soup. She was 84 years old, her body a map of scars and stories that no one asked to hear anymore. The Buyur system had succeeded. It had turned a legend into a footnote. On that final day, there was no artillery barrage. There was no charge. There was only a quiet breath, and then silence. Milunka Savić died as she had lived for 50 years, in the shadows, unacknowledged by the institutions that owed her their existence. It was only when she was gone that the world felt the weight of what it had lost. Her funeral was attended by thousands, a sudden, sharp realization that the underdog had been among them all along, and they had let her scrub their floors until her heart stopped. If you believe that stories like Milunka Savić's deserve to be remembered, if you believe that the ghost in the machine should finally be seen, join our ranks by subscribing. The story of Milunka Savić is the ultimate paradox of history. It is a mirror reflecting a truth we often try to ignore, that society has a terrifying capacity to use the courage of the individual to save itself, only to discard that individual once the danger has passed. We see this same hubris in our modern world. We celebrate the essential workers, the frontline agents of change, the whistleblowers who stand against the system until the crisis is over. Then we return to our rigid hierarchies and our comfortable amnesia. The tragedy wasn't that Milunka was a woman in a man's war. The tragedy was that she was a hero in a world that prefers its heroes to be statues cold, silent, and incapable of asking for the dignity they earned. Why did the powerful system ignore the only tactic that could save them? Because the tactic required them to admit that their rules were wrong. It required them to see the human spirit instead of the rank on a sleeve. They couldn't do it then, and the question remains, can we do it now? We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.